Good morning, HP Motors customers. What are you looking at today? Well, today you're looking at the crankshaft, the front of the crank. That's actually the crank pulley and the pulley boss in front of it on the front of a Mazda Miata motor. So you're looking at the front of the Mazda Miata motor and specifically where the crankshaft comes out of the block. This is the gear and this is the timing mark. So, what are we discussing today? Today we're discussing the in the Miata community what's known as the infamous crank wobble. It can actually occur on a lot of motors with a similar design. It has less to do with design and more to do with maintenance techniques, and that's what we're going to be talking about. But specifically in the Miata community, the crank wobble is famous. It's actually not uncommon on the B-Series Mazda motor in general, and that motor was installed in lots of Mazdas, lots of Kias, or at least a few Kias, and some Fords. I'll have a list of all the cars that I know of that have a version of the Mazda B-Series motor on the website along with this video, so you can check it out there to see if you have a potential candidate. But also keep in mind, if your car has a timing belt, it still has the potential to have this problem, because it's not truly a design flaw, it's a maintenance flaw. Anyway, a little more backstory so that makes sense. This car arrived with complaints of running issues, missing, poor throttle response, and loss of power, but all that was sporadically. And while that can be any number of things in the ignition system or the fueling system or with timing, what helped us clue it in was this new owner bought it from the previous owner who was trying to get rid of those problems. And the previous owner told him, hey, this all started after I had a shop install my timing belt. Probably within, I would say, 5,000 miles, but that's an estimate. And that's important, because like I said, when you hear just a description of what's going on, you're not sure where it could be in any number of the in one of those three main systems. And hearing about the timing belt helps us narrow it down to probably somewhere in the timing. Now, the current owner is pretty good with cars, so we asked him, hey, have you verified your timing marks to make sure they're accurate? He said, yes, I have. That's why I want you to take a look at it, because the timing looks good. And as you can see here, this is your main timing mark for the crank. And this is the main timing belt gear for the crank, and the timing mark on the block. And then you would, if you're installing a timing belt, verify it against, or line it up with the timing marks that would be on the crankshaft pulleys here. However, the crankshaft pulleys aren't on there right now. This is where they would be located. I have them off to replace the seals here in a little bit. Anyway, those are your three main timing marks on a Mazda Miata motor, the B-Series motor in general, whether it's single overhead cam or dual overhead cam. And those are the three marks you're supposed to line up when you're installing a timing belt. However, if you're just trying to verify timing, you have the water pump, the covers, the crank dampener pulley here. The crank dampener is what provides the surface for the belts to ride on, as far as the alternator, water pump, power steering, air conditioning. All those belts ride on a crank dampener pulley that's out here. And then there's also covers in the way. So because this mark is pretty well covered up when the motor's all together, you're provided with a secondary timing mark on the crank damper, which goes here, as I mentioned. And there's timing marks to verify it against on that timing belt cover. It's a plastic cover, and they're located right about where my finger's floating. I'll go show you those parts now. This is the damper I mentioned. You can see there's the surfaces for the belt to ride on, and these notches here would be the timing marks, and this cover here that you're looking at goes on the front of the motor, and that T and that 10 degrees mark are both the secondary timing marks that I mentioned. And that's how you verify timing on this car once you have the actual crankshaft covered up with all the other components. So the gentleman said he'd verified the timing marks. He'd actually held the part in his hand and it didn't look damaged or anything, so he didn't think he had crank wobble. But what he was probably holding in his hand was that crank dampener, and he was probably using those timing marks to line it up. So he had his pulleys exposed, and he had those marks lined up, and then he had the dampener lined up, and it looked all good. He was like, yeah, it looks fine. But what he didn't know is when you get the wobble, you can see it shifting here. So even though it looks lined up, it actually wasn't lined up. You get the boss out of the way, and we'll see that this is your woodruff key here. It locks the crank and the timing gear together to help you with alignment. And it's not designed to hold load. It's simply there to help you get it aligned properly. It's to make sure that you don't get this thing out of alignment. But it's not supposed to have this much of a gap. I don't know if you can see it too well on this side, but there's a gap there. And it's not supposed to be there. And this is actually what's causing the problem. You can see how I'm turning it back and forth in my hands. It's not supposed to be able to do that. and this is just my fingers. If you have the forces of the motor behind it, it's going to jump around a whole lot more. And that explains the sporadic issue of timing problems. Sometimes it'll be in alignment, sometimes it won't, and it moves around. If we pull out this little woodruff key here, I don't know how well you can see it, if it's going to focus on it, but basically it's pretty beat up. You can see how it's actually completely shoved over to one side. It's been beat on pretty thoroughly. And if we pull out the timing gear, it's been walled out as well. It's not as bad as the woodruff key, but it's all going to get replaced because it's all been damaged. However, the important thing here is the crankshaft itself has also been pretty badly damaged. It's supposed to be nice and square, and as you can see here, it's just flared out and ruined. So why that's bad is because all these other parts I mentioned, your gear, your worn out little timing boss here, or crank damper boss here, the woodruff key, the crank pulley, it's all replaceable. Here we have the new nice square woodruff key. We have a new nice square timing pulley. We have a new crank bolt, and we have a new pulley boss. And all that's looking good. However, with this crankshaft, you can't easily replace it. The factory OEM repairs, if this happens, is to replace the crankshaft. But that means rebuilding the bottom end or getting an entirely new or used motor, and all that's very expensive. So what we do as a patch, it is not an official OEM fix, but it's cheaper and it's always worth trying first to save money, is we use something called Belzona here as an example, but there are others. And this is like super duper JB Weld. It's an industrial strength ceramic metal epoxy. It's used to repair, industrial turbine housings and things like that. It's pretty expensive. And it's basically a ceramic epoxy that sets up and becomes as strong or even stronger than certain metals. So you can mill it, you can grind on it, you can sand it. And we're going to use it to fill in this gap here to repair this crankshaft as best as possible. And then we'll put in all new components and set it up as good as new. And even though this isn't a warranty guaranteed fix, we've had great results with it. Because it's not an OEM repair, we can't warranty it. But so far we've done it on a lot of these cars, and we've never had a return, we've never had a failure. So it does have good results. And when you look at what it costs to use this method versus replacing the whole motor or rebuilding the bottom end, it's always a better option to try this first. A lot of people in the Miata community think this is a 1.6 only problem, but as you can see here, this is not a 1.6 motor in this car. This isn't even an early 1.8 motor. This is a late model 1.8 motor. And the reason why this happens isn't because of a poor design, because that woodruff key was never designed to carry the load of the motor anyway. It's all down to this crank bolt here. That's what holds everything in place. And so when someone replaces the timing belt, they usually don't torque it properly, they don't use Loctite, these threads stretch, something like that. And it allows the timing components to get loose, to get walled out. So that's why it's not a 1.6 issue versus a 1.8 issue. Nowadays, since we have so many 1.8s on the road, we actually see this happen a lot more often to the 1.8 motors than the 1.6 motors. It was never designed to begin with. It was improper maintenance, and that's why it can also happen to other cars that have timing belts as well. It comes down to making sure that you're torquing that bolt properly and making sure that everything is going to last and isn't going to get loose on you. So that's all I have for today. I hope it's been informative, and if you have this issue, please come talk to us. I think we have a repair that can get you going in the right direction. See you next time. Good morning. Okay, I mentioned that I would try to grab some pictures of this if I remembered. So here we have the new woodruff key and the new pulley, and as you can see, there's a little bit of the Belzona mixture. I don't know if you can see it too well, if the phone will focus, but a little bit of the Belzona mixture next to the crank woodruff key there. Give it a second to maybe try to focus. Well, it's not going to because it's a phone camera, but I think you can still see that little bit of that gray blurriness between the crank and the woodruff key itself. And from there, it's locked down pretty darn hard. And from this point, we'll take the new boss, and we would put it on the front there, like so. And as you can see, last time I was turning it, it wiggled a lot more. If you recall in the previous video, the old one wiggled a lot more. So even without the crank bolt here that does all the holding to hold it in place, there's a lot less play there than once was. I don't know if you recall in the previous video, but it could wiggle a whole lot more. So once again, once we have the new bolt in place, which we have right over here, this fella, with its fresh threads. We'll get some Loctite on there. We will torque it properly. We have a device that allows us to torque these things, hold the crank very still. All the actual holding tension will be held through the crank bolt on here, and the woodruff key will once again simply be acting as a locating device for the pulley, boss, and everything. And we'll get the timing belt lined up directly and everything before we have the timing belt put on. But that's basically all there is to the repair, and we've had good results with it. So, we'll move on. Thanks and have a great day. Alright, back again, and I don't know if you can see it up in there, but this is the bar provided by a reputable aftermarket supplier to hold the hold the crank while you torque down that bolt, which is one of the main issues with what's causing the issue in the first place. If you recall, I said improper torque is usually what causes this on these cars. But that bar, as you can see, is usable, but we found insubstantial for a lot of these that just have been locked down by wallowing out. You're going to need something a lot bigger. So this is what we use for breaking them loose and setting them to make sure you can get proper torque. And we set the torque exactly where it needs to be. This very large bar lets us set it properly, make sure it's been torqued exactly how you want. We're not just nailing it down with an air wrench. And I can't really torque it with one hand holding the phone here, but we're going to lock her down, and then I'll show you how the timing works, and this part of the project will be all wrapped up. Alright, so there's the timing mark all lined up with a new bolt and a new boss and a new pulley. You can't see the woodruff key anymore, but there is the crank mark lined up from crank pulley to block. And if we scan up here, we'll see the timing marks for both the crank pulleys I mentioned earlier. It's hard to see in one picture, but they have been verified to be all lined up and ready to go, and the belt was pre-tensioned over here, this little pre-tension mark you see. Also, earlier I mentioned all the corrosion from a bad water pump. You can still see some of the red rust down there, where I tried to get it off as best I could, but the important thing is internally we cleaned out all the metal passageways, and we're going to be replacing the hoses to get rid of all that corrosion. And there you are, though, with the Belzona fix and these new components and a nice fresh belt and everything. Our experience has been that it's a good, solid repair. It's not factory warranted, it's not OEM suggested, but it's your best option in a situation like this to try first before you go replacing the whole motor. And I expect that he'll get a lot of good miles out of this motor this way. So, anyway, this is HP Motors signing off again. Thanks for the time.